Once upon a time, in the heart of a lush and prosperous kingdom, there reigned a king named Richard. Wise, thoughtful, and deeply concerned for his people, King Richard understood that the true pulse of his kingdom could not be felt from a gilded throne. He often mused, "How can I rule justly if I do not know the struggles of my people?" Richard's advisors constantly assured him that his kingdom thrived. They reported on grand harvests, peaceful villages, and contented citizens. But the king was no fool. He suspected that there were truths hidden beneath the polished reports of the court. He wanted to see the reality for himself, not through the eyes of courtiers, but through the eyes of a common man. One crisp autumn morning, when the golden leaves fell like scattered coins, King Richard donned a humble cloak of coarse wool. He concealed his royal attire beneath it and left the castle on foot, his royal guards sworn to secrecy. Disguised as a traveler, he set out alone, with only a loaf of bread in his satchel and a heart full of curiosity. Feeling weary himself, Richard sat on a worn stone bench near the edge of the square, where he spotted a boy no older than 10 sitting on the ground, his clothes patched and worn. The boy clutched a stale loaf of bread, gnawing at it as if it were a feast. Curious, the king approached him. "May I sit beside you?" Richard asked. The boy looked up, his brown eyes wide with surprise but not fear. "Of course, sir," he replied, scooting over to make room. They sat in silence for a while, the boy munching on his bread and the king observing him. Eventually, Richard spoke. "That bread looks good. Are you not worried about sharing it?" The boy smiled shyly. "It's not much, but I can share if you're hungry." Richard was moved by the boy's generosity. "What is your name?" "Thomas," the boy answered. "What's yours?" "Richard," the king replied simply, smiling at the irony. "Are you a traveler?" Thomas asked, tilting his head. "Yes, I've traveled from far away," Richard said, thinking of the distance between the throne room and the life of this boy. "Do you like it here in your village?" Thomas hesitated, his smile fading. "It's home," he said, "but sometimes I wish things were different." "What would you change?" Richard pressed gently. Thomas leaned in, his voice soft but earnest. "I'd make sure no one goes hungry. My mother says the taxes are too high and the baker can't give us bread like he used to. I heard her say that the king should help, but I think maybe he doesn't know." Richard's heart clenched at the boy's words. "And if you were king, what would you do?" Thomas straightened proudly, his eyes gleaming with hope. "I'd make sure everyone had food and a warm place to sleep. I'd listen to people. Kings are supposed to be fair, aren't they?" "Yes," Richard agreed, his voice heavy with thought. "A king should be fair." Thomas broke off a piece of his bread and handed it to Richard. "Here," he said, "it's not much, but it's all I have." Richard accepted it, feeling a lump in his throat. "Thank you, Thomas. You have a generous heart." Just then, a woman called from a nearby cottage. "Thomas, supper's ready." Thomas stood, brushing the crumbs from his lap. "That's my mother. I have to go." "Thank you for talking with me," Richard said, rising as well. Thomas grinned. "Maybe I'll see you again." "Maybe," Richard said, watching the boy run off toward the cottage with a lightness in his step. Richard returned to his castle that night, his heart heavy with the knowledge he had gained. He summoned his council the next morning, his face stern but resolute. "I have traveled through the kingdom," he began, "and I have seen what our people endure. Too many go hungry, and too many are burdened by the weight of unjust taxes." The advisors shifted uncomfortably, but none dared interrupt. "From this day forward," Richard declared, "we will lower the taxes on bread and grain. We will establish granaries to provide food for the poor during harsh seasons. And we will hold open courts where any subject may speak and be heard." The council murmured in astonishment, but they knew better than to argue. The king's word was law. In the months that followed, the kingdom began to change. The tax burden eased, and the granaries filled. Farmers no longer feared losing their land, and bakers were able to feed the hungry without fear of reprisal. True to his word, King Richard held open courts, listening to the concerns of the humblest of his subjects. One day, a young boy named Thomas came to the castle, holding his mother's hand. He did not recognize the king at first, but when Richard smiled and said, "It's good to see you again, Thomas," the boy's eyes lit up with recognition. "You're the king?" Thomas asked, astonished. "Yes," Richard said, kneeling to meet his gaze. "And I have you to thank for reminding me what it means to be a fair ruler." The story teaches that true leadership is not about command, but about service. The strongest rulers are those who listen, care, and act with kindness, for the heart of a king should always beat for his people.